Alright, what's going on, guys? I had the chance to play the new Souls-like, the First Berserker Khazan, a game that I've had my eye on for a while, and we've talked about several times here on the channel because it just looked like it was going to be really good. And now after playing it for several hours, I can pretty confidently say that it is. I was given early access to a beta version of the game that allowed me to play through the first 3 levels, but I gotta say, even going at my own pace, I was not able to finish it, simply because, in typical Souls-like fashion, this game is brutally difficult. And you guys know we're a Souls-like channel here. We live and breathe difficult boss fights. But I gotta tell you, Khazan might be one of the hardest I've played. But there's a lot of nuance and different reasons for why that is, and we're gonna break all of it down. So as we get started today, if you're new to the channel and enjoy all things Souls-like, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And again, a big thank you to First Berserker Khazan for letting me play this early. And now let's get into it. In the action RPG genre, the word Souls-like gets thrown around a lot. Sometimes it's warranted and others it's exaggerated. However, for this one, while the game has many new innovations that we'll talk about, the core here is built from the Souls-like framework in the same way that Lies of P was. And if I had to give a direct comparison of how the game actually plays, it did feel the most similar to Lies of P to me, although quite faster. First Berserker Khazan is structured in a level format. You have checkpoints you can rest at to upgrade your character, refill your healing items, at the cost of respawning all the enemies in the level, and you will respawn here after you die. And of course, in typical Souls-like fashion, you'll be going through the levels, looking for more checkpoints or shortcuts back to the others. The exploration again felt most similar to Lies of P in my opinion. At least for the early 2 levels that I played, it was fairly linear. Now, possibly the biggest deviation from the Souls-like formula is, as I said, that the game is mission-based. This is not an interconnected world, and there's no warping between checkpoints, at least so far. It's entirely possible that you find a hub or a new area later on and unlock the ability, but again, as far as I got, I did not encounter that. When you beat the boss of the level, you will get a mission completed screen and be automatically sent to the next one. I don't yet know if there will be a way to go back. But let's talk about the subject that many of you are likely most interested in, the combat. And again, this is where I have to give a comparison to Lies of P, for better and worse in my opinion, because the game has a very parry-centric combat. You'll be parrying attacks 90% of the time and dodging maybe 10. And in fact, I found the dodge pretty unreliable, at least without any upgrades in the skill tree, which I wasn't able to fully access. Khazan's actual movement though, feels very good. It's not floaty or clunky, things have weight to them, and in general, this is the part of the game that impressed me the most because it just feels good to play, especially after I got the greatsword. Hits stagger enemies. There does appear to be poise and hyper armor, which means you can actually make use of heavier weapons in a different playstyle than using lighter ones. And I was really impressed with this because a lot of times Souls-likes get that wrong. There is actually a strategic reason to use a bigger weapon over a smaller one and vice versa. Combat in general flows around stamina. Stamina plays a massive role for both the player and the enemies. Every action you do takes a bit of your stamina, and everything you do to the enemies takes away their stamina as well. And I'm a little mixed on how this works, because breaking the stamina of an enemy allows you to do a visceral attack, which does a big chunk of damage, but if the player is hit while their stamina is depleted, it'll leave them in a vulnerable state, long enough for most enemies to kill you. And unfortunately, that happened a lot, because if you happen to miss a parry, and an enemy's attack breaks your guard, then it's over. Now, generally the parry window is pretty forgiving, and it did feel good and satisfying to land them, but the dodge did not. And in all honesty, it could be a skill issue, but the dodge window felt thinner than the parry window. Or it felt like there was some other factor that went into the dodge than simply having iframes. It's a little hard to describe. But where the combat comes into play the most is of course in the boss fights. And I can't lie to you guys, the 2 bosses I got to fight were brutal, Yetsuga being the first one. And it's like if they stuck Guardian Ape from Sekiro as the first boss of the game. And that's not an exaggeration, it literally has several of Guardian Ape's moves. This thing is tough, man, and I was stuck here for a while. It's not that any of its moves are particularly hard to time or difficult to land the parries on. The issue I was having was that the room for error to actually beat these bosses is so thin, since they have a ton of health and you don't. Realistically, you can only get hit by like a handful of attacks before you're out of heals, and then you're dead. And that's accounting for the entire run of the fight. Now, I'm not saying that's a particularly good or bad thing, but to go back to the Lies of P comparison, you're in a situation where you need to memorize memorize all of the boss's attacks. Some people may like that, others may not. Personally, I like to have a bit more freedom in how I approach a boss, and I think especially for the first boss of the game, this entire early section would feel much better if everything had about 20% less health. A lot of people are going to get filtered right here. Now, I'll explain more of why I don't think that's going to be the case for the rest of the game, but I can't lie to you guys. It's very hard. Once I got the greatsword, I enjoyed the way the game flowed more, and the Blade Phantom as the second boss still kicked my teeth in. The issue I had with this boss was that he has very long combo streams, and if you don't land the parries exactly, then you can very easily find yourself out of stamina and in that exhausted state where you are going to die. Now, that's not to say the bosses are bad by any means. I actually think they're really good boss fights, but perhaps a bit extreme for the point of the game that they're at, being right at the beginning. But another way that Khazan sets itself aside from traditional Souls-likes is through its gear system, and this might actually be one of my main negatives of the game. When you defeat enemies or open chests or find loot throughout the world, you can obtain different armor pieces and weapons. For example, when I killed this cave bear here, I received an Imperial Soldier's dual-wield weapon, and you may notice the little blue arrow on it. That's because the Imperial Soldier's dual-wield weapon is a higher level than the default one I started with, and that's par for the course for pretty much any kind of looter game. Loot has levels, and you can get the same item but at a higher level having better stats. And you may be wondering, well, that's normal for pretty much any other game. What's the issue here? Well, the problem is things are directly scaling, so one thing will very clearly be better than the other. The problem is, this game also still relies on builds, and you have armor throughout the game that has different kinds of stats and abilities, and set bonuses for wearing the same type of gear that belong to that set. And the abilities aren't the problem here. I actually think they're really cool, but when you get those abilities, you complete a set, and you start to make your build around it, you'll likely then get a new piece of gear that is obviously better, but doesn't have those abilities. But in order to keep up with the progressing difficulty of the game, you have to lose that armor that you built around. It's kind of like Wukong. If you played that game, it has a very similar armor trend, but the abilities that those armors have are pretty negligible, and there's a very clear set progression. Now, it may end up being the same for Khazan. I don't know yet because I haven't played the full game and I wasn't actually able to complete a full set of armor, but I don't like the potential situation you could get in here, where say you've built up a strength build around the greatsword, but you're stuck with the level 5 greatsword, while the game is getting harder and you're finding the other weapon types at level 10 or 12 or so on, and you may be forced to abandon your build just because you didn't find the right kind of loot. Now, that's purely hypothetical, and they may do a great job of dispersing the loot to where you find an even amount of everything. Personally, I'm just not thrilled on that idea or possibility, but we're just gonna have to see how it ends up playing out. It could, for all we know, significantly enhance the RPG feeling of the game, and some of you may really like that. We'll see though. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, where I don't think the difficulty level is going to be as extreme later on in the game, because there's tastes of abilities that you can eventually have through the skill tree and the gear upgrades that could lead to some pretty crazy builds, where you're not entirely reliant on just your parry timing in order to combat the boss. For example, the first skill I unlocked in the skill tree made my successful parries do damage to the boss. Now, it was pretty minuscule damage, but it was helpful in the long run. We saw a bit of this in one of the game's trailers, where you unlock all these crazy moves and can do massive chunks of damage to the boss. But when your only tools are the parry and dodge, it's incredibly difficult. I wish I could give you more insight onto how these abilities work, but I unfortunately did not get to use them, just because I didn't make it far enough in the beta before the time ran out. Again, I could give the comparison of Lies of P, where the skill tree in that game makes a massive difference. To give my final thoughts though on what I played, the only other negative I could say was that there wasn't enough of the story to hook me. Perhaps if you are familiar with the DNF lore, then you'll understand things a lot better. While I thought it was cool, I'm just not hooked yet, and like other things I mentioned, that will likely change as the game goes on. But overall, I am really impressed with the game. I thought the gameplay was fantastic. The combat is fun and satisfying, and while I was getting my teeth kicked in by the bosses, I was having fun doing it. Although the exploration and the world are pretty bland, I'm sure there will be much better levels further on. But those are my first impressions of First Berserker Khazan. I am impressed. Once again, let me give them a massive thank you for giving me this opportunity, and the official beta is starting in a few days, that many of you can check out by signing up on their website. You don't just have to take my word for it, you can try it yourself. And I'm curious to hear what you guys think. With all that though, if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to leave a like on it and subscribe if you're new around here, and I will catch you in the next one.